She was threading her third bootlace when the platoon sergeant told her to stay off the net, and she nodded like a woman agreeing to weather. Dana Wells did not look up. She finished the lace, pulled it snug, tied it off with the flat knot her uncle had taught her on a boat deck 20 years back, and set the boot beside its twin under the cot. Around her, the aid station hummed with men who had already decided what she was. Attached medic, augmentee. The word they used when they meant she did not belong to them and never would. She heard it twice before her coffee was cool enough to drink. "You're the trauma girl they sent up from the aviation date," a corporal said. It was not a question. He was looking at the cross on her shoulder and the smallness of her kit and doing the arithmetic that everyone did. "Dana," she said, "and you're going to want your left boot dried out before tonight. You've got a hot spot starting on that heel, or you wouldn't be standing like that." He blinked. He had not told anyone about the heel. He shifted his weight, caught himself doing it, and stopped. She drank her coffee. Somewhere down the valley, past the wire and the sandbagged berms and the long dry slope that fell away toward the river, 50 Rangers were spread across a hilltop outpost called Coil, and by this time tomorrow they would be cut off, and the men in this tent would have watched 3 relief columns turn back off a road nobody could hold. Dana knew none of that yet, the way you know a headline. She knew it the way she knew the corporal's heel, from the small tells, the things the body says before the mouth catches up. The radio traffic that morning had too many pauses in it. Pauses were information. Her uncle used to say the sea told you it was going to turn a full hour before it turned, if you were the kind of person who shut up and watched the water instead of your own hands. She was the kind of person who shut up and watched. Nobody in that tent expected her to be standing on the high ground north of Coil before the next sundown, alone, with a radio and a medruck and a rifle she had not yet been issued, doing the one thing none of the 50 could do for themselves. But that was the shape the next 30 hours were going to take, whether the corporal believed it or not. If you're the kind of person who shuts up and watches, stay with me to the end of this one. You're going to want to be there when she walks down off that hill with a man on her back and hands him to the people who'd already written him off. Subscribe if a story about being underestimated is one you know from the inside, wherever you're listening from tonight. Denver, Glasgow, a parking lot in Sacramento with the engine still running. This one earns the weight. The skill in her hands was not a soldier's skill, not at the root of it. It had come off the water. Dana had grown up on the Washington coast in a gray town that smelled of diesel and salt and the inside of a bait cooler, and her Uncle Ray had run a 42-foot longliner out of the harbor there since before she could walk. Her mother worked the cannery line and disapproved of the boat the way some people disapprove of weather, steadily, without any real hope of changing it. So the boat became Dana's, in the way a thing becomes yours when the person who owns it stops fighting your love of it. Ray took her out summers from the time she was 9. He was a wide, unhurried man with hands like tackle and a way of saying almost nothing until the almost nothing mattered. What he taught her, without ever calling it teaching, was how to keep a thing alive that was trying to die on a heaving deck with the wrong tools and no time. A crewman opened his forearm to the bone on a gaff once, 40 miles out, and Ray had looked at the mess of it and then looked at Dana, 12 years old and white in the face, and said the thing she would still be hearing in her head 2 decades later. You don't work on the whole wound. You can't. You find the one thing that's killing him fastest, and you argue with that, just that. Then the next thing. The ocean's not going to give you the whole hour. It'll give you the next 2 minutes. So take the 2 minutes and do the loudest thing. Find the one thing killing him fastest and argue with that. She had packed a stranger's arm with a clean rag and her own 2 thumbs and held it 40 miles back to the harbor while Ray ran the boat flat out, and the man had lived, and Ray had never mentioned it again except to say, months later, over an engine he was pretending to fix, that she had good hands and a worse temper, and one of those was going to save her life someday. She had gone into the Army because the boats were dying and the town was dying, and a recruiter had looked at her aptitude scores and said the word medic like it was a door. She had trained harder than she needed to, the way people do when they suspect a room has already decided they are decoration. She had ended up attached to a special operations aviation element as a flight medic, which meant she went where the aircraft went and treated what the aircraft brought back. And it meant she was forever a guest in other men's units, wearing their patches on her sleeve and none of them in her heart. She was good. She knew she was good the way you know your own hands in the dark. but good, in a room full of men who had already read the first line of your file and stopped, is a thing you have to prove again every single morning. There was a letter in the bottom of her ruck she had been not answering for 8 months. It was from a woman named Carol Petrie, who had run the volunteer fire company back in the gray town and had pulled a 19-year-old Dana out of a car in the rain the night Dana's brakes had failed on the harbor road and put her upside down in the ditch below the cannery. Carol had climbed down into that ditch in the dark and held Dana's head still with her bare hands and talked to her for 40 minutes until the county truck came, and had never once made her feel like a fool, and had visited her twice in the hospital after, and had said, the second time, that if Dana ever wanted to learn what Carol knew, the door was open. Dana had not walked through that door. She had joined the army instead, which was a bigger door and a louder one, and she had told herself she would write to Carol properly once she had something to show for it. Then, 8 months ago, Carol's daughter had sent a letter saying Carol had retired, that the fire company had given her a plaque and a dinner, that Carol still asked after the Wells girl and wondered aloud sometimes whether she'd made it. There was a phone number at the bottom in a daughter's careful hand. Dana could have called it from the phased array tent any evening that week. The number would still connect. Carol was alive, retired, sitting in a house Dana could picture exactly, 10 minutes from water. It was the easiest unpaid thing in Dana's whole life, and she could not make herself do it. She did not fully know why. Something about arriving at that conversation with empty hands. Something about the woman having climbed into a ditch for her and Dana having climbed into the army and made a career of other people's emergencies and never once turned around and said, plainly, "You are the reason I know how." The letter sat in the bottom of the ruck under the spare tourniquets. It came north with her toward Coyle, unanswered, the way it had come everywhere else. The forward base was a scab of gravel and Hesco on a shelf of high desert, all dust and thin air and a wind that came up every afternoon like a bad habit. Dana had been there 4 days. On the second day, she watched a staff sergeant named Beck try to reduce a dislocated shoulder in the chow line by having 2 men yank on it, which is a fine way to turn a bad afternoon into a career-ending one, and she had put her coffee down and crossed the gravel and said quietly, "Stop, stop. You're going to tear something he needs. Sit him down. Let me." Beck had looked at the cross on her sleeve and the top of her head, which came up to about his collarbone, and said loud enough for the line to hear, "The det sent us a medic the size of a carbine. You sure you can move a grown man's arm, sweetheart? Or you want me to do the heavy part?" The line laughed. It was the easy laugh of men who are relieved the joke is not about them. Dana did not answer him. She knelt, took the soldier's wrist and elbow, told him quietly to breathe out and think about something boring, and walked the arm through an arc so slow and so certain that the joint slid home with a sound like a drawer closing, and the man made a noise he was embarrassed about, and it was over. She stood up, dusted her knees, and handed Beck back his silence. She did not smile at him. She just picked her coffee back up off the Hesco wall and walked away. And behind her, the line was very quiet, and Beck's ears were red. That was the antagonist, though nobody in that dust would have called him that. That was Beck. The next afternoon, she and a warrant officer named Lou Ferris spent 2 hours nose down in the guts of a casualty litter kit that had come up from theater assembled wrong, and she found she liked him. Ferris was a maintenance test pilot in his 50s who had been in the aviation community since before Dana was born and had the particular calm of a man who has auto-rotated a real aircraft to a real landing and lived, and therefore is not impressed by volume. They worked the kit apart and back together, and he watched the way she laid every part out in the order it came off and reversed the order to reassemble, never once hunting for a screw. And at the end, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. "You didn't learn that in a school," Ferris said. "No." "Boat?" She looked at him. "How?" "You lay your parts out like a man who's dropped one over the side before and only got to do it once." He almost smiled. "I ran a crab boat 2 seasons out of Kodiak before I ever saw a rotor. You never forget the water. It makes you tidy or it makes you dead." "My uncle," she said. "Longliner. Same idea." Ferris nodded slowly, like a thing had been confirmed that he'd suspected about her, and after that he was in her corner in a way she did not have to ask for. And on the 4th night she was funny. It surprised the men who had filed her under Grim. A specialist was moaning about the chow, and Dana, without looking up from re-rolling gauze, deadpanned an account of a Thanksgiving her uncle had cooked on a marine engine block wrapped in foil 40 miles out in 6-foot swell. The turkey sliding the length of the galley every time the bow came down, Ray chasing it with a boat hook, the two of them finally eating it braced in the companionway with their boots hooked under the rail, the best and worst meal of her life. She did the boat hook. She did Ray's face. She had them, 6 of them, wheezing on ammo cans in the dark, and for about 11 minutes she was not the trauma girl from the det. She was Wells, who was all right, who had a boat in her somewhere, and a straight face that made the story land twice as hard. Even a ranger sergeant passing in the dark stopped to listen and left grinning and did not know her name yet. There was a young private on the wire that night, a kid named Tooze, first deployment, who had drawn the shift outside the aid tent and watched Dana through the open flap resplint a broken finger for a mechanic who'd caught it in a hatch. She did it in about 90 seconds. She never stopped talking to the man, asked about his kids, laughed at something, taped the splint without looking at her own hands because she was looking at his face to see where the pain lived. Toes watched the whole thing and could not have told you what was remarkable about it. It looked like nothing. It looked like a woman wrapping a finger. But it stuck in him the way a smell sticks, and days later, when everything had gone sideways and loud, Toes would be the one who said the true thing about her, because he had seen it first when it was quiet and could not name it. The wind dropped at 0400, and that was the first wrong thing. Dana was awake for it, the way she was awake for most wrong things, and she lay on the cot and listened to the bass breathe and understood, before any radio told her, that the pauses from the morning before had grown teeth. At 0410, the net came alive and did not go quiet again. Coyle was in contact. Coyle had been in contact since 0330 and had not said so because the first thing they lost was the retrans, and the second thing they lost was 2 men, 50 Rangers on a hilltop the size of a soccer pitch, and the road up to them, the only road, was now a kill zone, and a relief column that had rolled at first light had already turned back with wounded and a burning truck blocking the switchback. 50. That was the number. Dana heard the battle captain say it on the net, flat, twice, the way you say a number you are afraid of. 50 souls on Coyle and no clean way to reach them, and the aid station on the hill running out of the things that keep the badly hit from becoming the dead. She was dressed before the officer came looking for her. His name was Colonel Marcus Reyes, and he found her by the flight line at 0450 with her medruck already on and her jaw set, and he had the look of a man about to do a thing he had argued against. Wells. He stopped in front of her. He was tall and gray, and he had, 4 days ago, signed the personnel roster that listed her as augmentee, attached, non-organic, and had thought nothing of it. They've got mass casualties on Coyle and no surgeon and no way in on the road. We can put 1 bird into the saddle north of the hill, 1 pass before the lights full up, and drop a single medic to hold what's holdable until we break the road tonight. 1. That's the whole margin. Ferris says it's you or it's nobody, and I've learned this week not to argue with Ferris. He stopped. Something moved in his face that cost him. I read your file as a line item, Reyes said. 4 days ago, I'd have sent you to inventory the cold chain fridge. I was wrong about what I had. I'm telling you that plainly because you're about to earn the right to hear it, and because if I'm sending you up there, I owe you the truth before I owe it to anybody else. Will you go? Dana looked past him at the hills going from black to iron in the east, and at the one gap in them, the saddle, where a bird could sneak in low if the pilot had more nerve than sense. Get me on the aircraft, she said. Then she keyed nothing, said nothing dramatic, just turned to the crew chief already spooling up and said, Medruck's 40 pounds. I'll sit left. I go out the second, we're light on the skids. Don't wait for me to be pretty about it. Terse. Flat. Nothing in it of trauma girl or sweetheart or the size of a carbine. Just a professional stating a load and a plan, and the crew chief nodded like she was exactly who he'd hoped they'd send. The bird went in low and fast with the dawn behind it, and Dana rode the whole way with her hand on the door and her mind gone quiet the way it always went quiet when the noise finally matched the size of the thing. The saddle north of Coyle was a shallow bowl of scree and stunted brush, maybe 400 meters below the outpost, screened from the enemy on the far ridge by the shoulder of the hill itself. The pilot, a woman named Cass Ortiz, whom Dana had never met and would love forever, flew it like she was threading a needle with the aircraft, dumped down into the bowl in a hurricane of grit, and Dana was out the door and flat on the scree before the skids fully settled. And the bird was gone again, clawing back into the murk, and the sudden silence it left behind was enormous. She lay in it and listened. Small arms fire up the slope, the tapping kind and the deeper kind, and under it, the specific quiet of men conserving ammunition. She came up the slope to Coyle in short rushes and reached the wire and was hauled over a sandbag berm by a ranger who stared at her like she'd fallen out of the sky, which she had, and the first thing she saw inside the perimeter told her Ray's rule was the only rule that was going to matter today. The aid position was a scrape in the dirt behind a wall of ammo cans, and there were 11 wounded in it and one exhausted junior medic and a platoon sergeant named Del Kovach, who was doing 3 jobs and losing at all of them. 11. Some of them were going to be fine. Some of them were arguing with the ground already. Dana dropped her ruck and did the only thing there was time to do, which was to walk the row once, fast, reading bodies the way Ray had read water. Not the loudest man, the quietest one, the gray one, the one whose breathing had the wrong music in it, and she found the thing killing each of them fastest, and she argued with that and only that and moved on. "You," she said to the junior medic, whose name was Pruitt and whose hands were shaking. "Breathe. You're not out of anything. You just think you are. I need you doing exactly one thing, and I'm going to tell you the thing." She pointed. "That man's airway. Sit at his head. Keep it open the way I show you. Don't leave him for anybody who yells louder. Yell for me if his color changes. That's your whole war. Go." Pruitt went and steadied, because a scared person handed one clear task will hold a line. A scared person handed the whole war will run from. For the next 40 minutes, Dana ran the aid scrape like a deck in a storm. Chest seal. Tourniquet high and tight. Converted later when there was a later. A man with a belly wound she could do almost nothing for but keep warm and talk to. And she talked to him and learned his name, and it mattered. The fire outside rose and fell. Twice rounds came through the position, and everyone got small, and she stayed on her knees over an open wound because you cannot pack a wound from the fetal position, and someone had to not get small. Kovach watched her do it and stopped, somewhere in there, treating her like weather, and started treating her like water. The thing you respect because it will kill you if you don't, and keep you alive if you read it right. There was a ranger named Alvarez shot through the upper leg, and the round had found the big vessel there, and he was the fastest dying man on the hill. Dana got both thumbs into it, and the bleeding slowed and did not stop. And she knew a thumb is not a plan, a thumb is a sentence you say to buy the next sentence, and she got a junctional clamp seated by feel while a firefight happened over her head. And Alvarez, gray and calm the way the worst off get calm, looked up at her and asked her the only question anyone up there really wanted answered. "Am I going to see my wife again?" "Not going to die. See his wife, Rosa." He said the name after, quiet, like a man laying something valuable on a table. Rosa was pregnant, 7 months back in Georgia, and Alvarez had a plan that he told Dana in pieces while she worked because talking kept him tethered. He was going to be there for it, he had promised. He had a 2-week pass approved and a flight already booked for the week the baby was due. He was going to be in the room. He was not going to be one of those fathers who heard about it on a phone. "You're going to see her," Dana said. "Not I hope. Not we'll try." She looked him in the eye and gave him a fact because a drowning man cannot hold on to a hope. It's too slick. He needs something with edges. "I've got the bleeding. You're not going to die on this hill. I'm going to hand you to a surgeon tonight, and you're going to be a nuisance to a nurse in Germany inside a week, and you're going to be in that room in Georgia when your kid shows up. That's not me being nice to you. That's the plan. Hold my plan." Alvarez held her plan. His color came back a shade. She got him packaged and moved him up the priority line and turned to the next quiet man, and her hands, which had just done the loudest thing, went straight to the close, careful work of a saline lock and a slow-push drug. The same hands, gentle now, because that is the whole trade. The violence and the tenderness live in the same two hands, and you switch between them without dropping either. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, she keyed the net to check on a casualty they'd moved to the far side of the perimeter and called for the medic she'd left there. A name, Vasquez, and got nothing. She called again, nothing. A third time, and the not answering went on long enough that the cold came up the back of her neck. Because a channel that does not answer is a channel telling you something, and she did not know yet whether it meant the man was busy or the man was gone, or the whole far corner of the hill had come apart while she had her thumbs in Alvarez's leg. The silence stretched. 4 seconds. 7. She kept her voice flat and called a fourth time and made herself keep working while she waited, and it was the longest 10 seconds of the morning until Vasquez came back on, breathless, alive, pinned but alive, and Dana let out a breath she had not told anyone she was holding. By noon, the aid scrape was stable, which on Coil only meant nobody knew had started dying, and the harder truth arrived with the heat. Kovac found her behind the ammo cans and crouched and laid it out in the flat voice men use for the things they can't fix. The enemy had brought up a heavy machine gun overnight, dug it into a stone sanger on the nose of the far ridge, and it had the whole southern face of Coil enfiladed, the entire approach, the switchback, the ground any relief force would have to cross. As long as that gun lived, the road stayed shut, and the road staying shut meant no ground evac tonight, which meant Alvarez and the belly wound and 2 others were going to run out of time somewhere around dark. The gun was in a stone-walled pit on a reverse slope. Artillery couldn't get the angle. A gun run from the air would have to fly straight down the throat of it. And it was 1,100 meters away across a gorge tucked behind a lip of rock, so that only the top third of the sanger, the crew's heads and the gun's own top cover, ever showed above the stone. "We can't get at it," Kovac said. "We've tried. It's behind the rock. You can only see the top of the thing, and you can't kill a gun by parting a man's hair. We put 4 of the best shooters on this hill on it this morning, and we've got nothing to show but a lower ammo count." Dana looked across the gorge at the Sangar for a long time. She was a medic. She had a rifle she'd been handed at the berm and had barely looked at. This was not her trade, and she knew it, and she almost said so. And then she looked at the gun's top cover, a sheet of corrugated metal, and above it, wedged into the stones of the Sangar wall, to hold that cover down against the wind that scoured that ridge every afternoon. A long steel picket, a fence stake, driven in at an angle. She had been on that base 4 days. She knew that wind. It came up every afternoon like a bad habit, off the high desert, hard out of the west, and it was coming up right now. She could feel it starting to lean on the brush around the scrape. And she knew, because Ferris had said it and Ray had said it before him, that a thing lashed down against the wind is only as strong as the one point holding the lashing. And if you free that one point, the wind does the rest of the work for you. All of it, more than you ever could by hand. She did not have a plan yet. She had the first thing of a plan, which is all Ray ever promised the ocean would give you. The far ridge went quiet in a way that meant the gun crew was changing belts. And into that quiet, over the net, came a voice Dana knew, because the relief effort down in the valley had a new man running the ground tactical piece, and the new man was Beck. Beck had come up with the second relief column, the one now stalled behind the burning truck on the switchback, and Beck could see the same Sangar from below that Dana could see from the hill, and Beck understood, because he was not a fool, only a loud man, that nothing moved up that road until the gun on the ridge stopped breathing, and Beck had been told by Kovac, over the net in front of everyone, that the only person on Coil who had put eyes on the Sangar's one weak point and had a notion how to kill it was the augmentee medic, Wells, the trauma girl the size of a carbine. There was a silence on the net before Beck keyed up. Dana counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 seconds of a man swallowing every word he had ever said in a chow line in front of 2 relief columns and a battalion net and a colonel listening in the rear. 6 seconds, 7. Then Beck keyed the radio, and his voice was scraped down to the bone. and he said the thing it cost him everything to say. "Coyle, this is Cutlass 6 on the ground. Put Wells on. Get me the medic. Wells. I need Wells on this net, and I need whatever she's got, because I've got 22 men behind a burning truck who don't move until that gun's dead, and she's the only one up there who's seen how to kill it. Wells, please, please." Beck said please on an open net. Up and down, 2 columns, men who had heard him call her sweetheart 4 days ago went very still. Ferris, monitoring from the rear, closed his eyes. And Dana, on her knees in the dirt 1,100 meters from a gun she was not trained to kill, picked up the rifle she had barely looked at and keyed the net and said, "Cutlass, this is Wells. I hear you. Give me 4 minutes and don't let anybody move on that road until I say the word." The rifle was a ranger's spare, a good one, and she'd checked it out of habit at the berm the way Ray checked a reel before he trusted a fish to it. Bolt, gas, glass, the round in the chamber. She had it now. Here was the whole of it, and she talked it out loud on the net as she built it, slow, so that Kovacs could hear it and Beck could hear it, and later swear to it, because a thing like this only counts if someone can follow it after. "The gun's behind the rock, so I can't kill the crew and I can't kill the gun," Dana said. "But I don't need to. See the top cover on that Sanger, the tin sheet over the crew? It's pinned down against the afternoon wind by 1 steel picket driven into the wall on the upwind side, west side, the one leaning stake holding the whole sheet flat. You see it?" "I see it," Kovacs breathed, beside her, glass up. "The wind's coming up right now. It comes up every afternoon off the desert, hard, out of the west, and it's building. I've watched it 4 days straight. That tin's a sail. Right now the picket's the only thing holding the sail down. I put a round on the base of that picket where it meets the stone, and I break it or I bend it out of the wall, and the wind takes the tin, rips the cover clean off the pit, and a heavy gun crew with their overhead cover gone and the whole sky suddenly open on them is a crew that stops firing and gets their heads down, because they don't know what's coming through that hole next. That's the window. That's when your birds roll in, and that's when Beck moves on the road. I'm not killing the gun. I'm opening the roof and letting the weather in. It was 1,100 meters. The picket was a finger of steel. The wind that was her whole plan was also the thing that would push her round off it, and she had to read the wind not off the far ridge. Any fool watches the dust at the target, but off her own skin and the brush at her own position and the long grass on the slope between, because the air she had to shoot through was the air right in front of her for the first 400 meters, and that was the air she could feel. She wetted a finger. She watched the near grass lie down and stand up. She felt the gusts come in their rhythm, the way swell comes in sets, and she knew, the way Ray knew when to gun the boat between waves, that you do not fight the gust. You wait for the pause between them and you send your work through the door while the door is open. She got down behind the ammo cans and built her position like building a nest, everything under her solid, her breath long, the reticle settling. She dialed the elevation for 1,100 by the little dope card taped to the stock and held for a wind she read at 9, gusting 13, left to right, and then she stopped holding for the gust and started waiting for the lull, because the lull was coming, the sets always broke, and she needed the round to fly in still air, even though the still air would only last a breath. "Everybody off the net," she said. "Don't move on that road. Wait for my call." The far ridge tapped and hammered. Alvarez, behind her, breathed. The wind came up in a long push that flattened all the grass on the slope, and Dana did not fire, waited, her heart slow, Ray's voice in her ear. "The ocean gives you the next 2 minutes. Take the 2 minutes." And the push crested and fell away, and in the falling, in the pause between that gust and the next, the grass stood up straight and still all down the slope, and she let her breath halfway out and pressed the trigger straight back, like closing a door on a sleeping child. The rifle spoke, and the sound went out across the gorge and came back off the far rock a full beat later, and for a long, long second nothing happened at all. The round was in the air for more than a second and a half, and every part of that second and a half happened inside Dana's chest. She stayed on the glass. She watched the Sanger the way she'd watched the water for a fish to turn. Nothing. Nothing. The tin sheet sat where it had sat all day. She had missed, she thought. She had missed and spent the lull, and now the gun would. The picket jumped. A spark and a ring of steel she couldn't hear at that distance, and the stake bent sideways out of the stone, and the upwind corner of the tin sheet lifted like a page turning, and then the next gust came up the gorge on schedule. The gust she had waited past right on time, and it got under the loosened sheet, and the whole top cover of the Sangar peeled up and away and cartwheeled off the back of the ridge like a playing card in a fan, and the gun pit was suddenly a bowl open to the whole white sky, 4 heads inside it staring up at a hole where their roof had been. "Cover's off!" Kovacs roared. "Cover's off the pit, the roof's gone, their heads down, their cutlass, coil, guns exposed and suppressed. Roll it now. Go!" Dana said into the net, flat, already reaching for her ruck, and the pair of birds that had been holding fuel-critical orbits behind the hill came around the shoulder in the same breath and rolled in on a gun crew that had nowhere to hide and no roof to hide under. And down on the switchback, Beck's column came out from behind the burning truck and up the road that no longer had teeth. She reported it the way you'd report a fuel state. "Cutlass coil. Guns off. Roads open. I've got 4 urgent surgical up here, and I need the first bird on the saddle in 1-5 mics, or I start losing the numbers I gave you." That was all. No triumph in it, no. She was already back on her knees beside Alvarez with her fingers on his pulse, and she did not say a single word about the shot, then or for a long time after, because the shot was over and Alvarez was not, and the trade only ever cares about the man who is still on the table. The count came home in pieces over the next 3 hours. The road held. The trucks got up the switchback, and the ground evac rolled, and Dana loaded her 4 urgent surgicals herself, Alvarez first, and she rode the first bird down with her hand on his chest the whole way, and handed him to a surgeon on the pad at the FOB, and said 4 sentences of report, and then had to be moved out of the way because she would not, on her own, stop holding the litter rail. It was only when the last bird was down and the last of hers was inside, and someone put a canteen in her hand, that Dana's own body finally told her what the day had cost. Her hands started to shake. Not before, not during, only now, in the safe gray light of the pad, with nothing left to hold. She looked at them shaking like they belonged to someone she was treating. Pruitt, the junior medic who'd come down on the second bird, sat down next to her on the skid and could not talk at all. Just sat, and she let him, and the 2 of them watched the sun go down over the hills that had tried to kill everyone all day, and neither of them said the number out loud, but they both knew it. 50 had gone up to coil. 50 had come off it, every one. The next morning, a man named Colonel Grady flew in from the regional command to reconcile the record. And Grady did not believe the record. He was not a cruel man, only a careful one. An aviation safety and standards officer whose entire job was making the paperwork match the world, and the paperwork he'd been handed did not match any world he knew. He sat Dana down in a plywood office with a fan pushing hot air around and a folder open in front of him and a look on his face like a man doing long division that keeps coming out wrong. "Sergeant Wells," he tapped the folder. "I've got a storyboard here, says the machine gun position on the North Ridge at Coil was neutralized at approximately 1400 by a single rifle round fired from the outpost, 1100 meters, and the shooter of record is you, a flight medic, attached. Non-organic to the ground element." He looked up. "Help me, because I have 4 Ranger snipers who put a combined I don't know how many rounds at that same position all morning and did nothing, and then you, no long gun qualification in your file above marksman, no schools, a medic E. You fire 1 round and the position folds. You understand why I'm sitting here. Walk me through what actually happened, because what's on this paper doesn't happen." So Dana walked him through it. Flat, plain, the way she'd talked it onto the net, because it was the same story, and it only had the one shape, the rock, the tin cover, the single picket holding the sail, the wind she'd watched for 4 days and read off the grass at her own feet. She was not trying to kill the gun, she told him. You can't. It's behind the stone. She was trying to open the roof and let the weather do what weather does to a thing that's only pinned at one corner. The snipers had been shooting at the crew and the gun, the parts you can't reach. She'd shot the one part of the whole system that, once you moved it, moved everything else. Grady listened. He asked 3 sharp questions, and she answered all 3 without a pause, and each answer closed a door he'd been holding open. And somewhere around the 3rd answer, the look on his face changed from a man checking a story to a man watching a proof complete itself. He closed the folder. "I came up here to find the error," Grady said. "That's the job. Find where the record's wrong and fix it." He rubbed his face. "There's no error. That's the part I'm going to have trouble writing up, because a flight medic read the wind and shot the roof off a machine gun to open a casualty corridor is going to get bounced back to me 3 times as impossible, and every time it comes back I'm going to have to send it up again because it's what happened." He stood, and he did a thing then that Grady did not do for sergeants, which was put out his hand. "I'll write it exactly the way you told it, word for word if I have to." They flew Dana back up the line 2 days later to the same forward base. And it was there, in the dark of the aid tent, with the generators ticking as they cooled, that she and Kovac finally talked. They were the only 2 still awake. Kovac had come down off coil with the rest and had attached himself quietly to wherever Dana was, the way survivors do. He sat across from her on an ammo can with 2 paper cups of coffee gone cold and pushed one across, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and the not saying was the conversation getting up its nerve. "I keep doing the math," Dana said finally, to the dark, not to him. "On Alvarez, on the belly wound, on all of them. I do the row again in my head. I walk the row again. And every time I walk it, I find the one I should have gotten to faster, and I move him up, and then somebody else is at the bottom of the new row dying because I moved the first one up, and it never comes out clean. It never comes out where nobody's at the bottom. There's always a bottom." She turned the cold cup in her hands. "I got everybody off that hill, and I still can't make the row come out clean, and I don't know how to put it down." Kovac was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what I saw," he said. "Not the shot. Everybody's going to talk about the shot. I saw before the shot. I saw you walk into a scrape with 11 down and 1 medic coming apart, and I watched you look at all of it for about 4 seconds and then stop looking at all of it. You quit trying to save everybody the second you got there. You found the fastest dying man in front of you, and you fought that, and you let the rest wait, and that's why the rest are alive, because you didn't try to make the row come out clean. You can't. Nobody can. The row doesn't come out clean. You're not doing math wrong, Wells. You're doing the only math there is, and it always has a bottom, and the bottom's still breathing because you did it right." He leaned forward. "You didn't fail the guy at the bottom of the row. You bought him the weight. That's the whole job. That's all any of us can do. You just do it better than anybody I've ever watched, and it's eating you because you think there was a clean version. There's no clean version. There's just the weight, and you're the best I ever saw at buying it." Dana looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and something in her chest that had been clenched since the saddle let go by a single notch. "Ray used to say that," she said. "Different words. He said you don't get the whole hour. You get the next 2 minutes." She almost smiled. "I've been trying to save the whole hour up there. My whole life, maybe." "Take the 2 minutes," Kovac said. "It's enough. It was enough for 50 guys." The letter was still in the bottom of the ruck. She found it 2 nights later, digging for a dry pair of socks, and she sat on the cot with it in her hands and understood, finally, why she hadn't called. And understood it because of the row, because of Kovac in the dark, because of the things she'd just learned about waiting for the whole hour when all you ever get is the next 2 minutes. She'd been waiting to call Carol until she had the whole hour, until she had something finished to show, until she could arrive at that conversation as a complete thing, a success, a career justified, hands full. And there was no whole hour. There was never going to be a whole hour. Carol was retired and alive and 10 minutes from the water right now, in the next 2 minutes, and the next 2 minutes were all anybody was ever promised, and Dana had spent 8 months holding out for an hour that did not exist while the woman who'd climbed into a ditch for her got older in a house by the sea. Nobody handed her this. No stranger from the gray town turned up on the base. No coincidence walked through the flap. She just sat on the cot with the socks in one hand and the letter in the other, and did the arithmetic she'd been refusing to do, the same arithmetic she did on the row. Stop waiting for clean, stop waiting for the whole hour. Argue with the thing that's dying fastest. And the thing dying fastest was the 8 months, and it was still dying, and she could still argue with it. She walked to the communications tent in the dark, and she asked the specialist on duty if there was any way in the world a person could get a morale call patched to a landline in Washington state. And the specialist, who had heard by now who she was, because everyone had, said, "For you, Sergeant, I will find a way." And he found a way. It rang twice. An older woman's voice said hello, wary of the strange number. And Dana opened her mouth and found that all the speeches she'd built over 8 months were gone, and what came out was just the true thing. "Carol, it's Dana. Dana Wells, the girl from the ditch on the harbor road." A silence, and then a sound on the other end that Dana felt in her sternum. "I should have called you 8 years ago. I should have called you the day I signed up and told you it was because of you, that I do this because of you. That every single time I put my hands on somebody, it's your hands I'm copying. The way you held my head in that ditch and talked to me like I was going to be fine. I never said it. I'm saying it. You're the reason I know how. I'm sorry it took me this long to turn around and say so." Carol Petrie, 71 years old, 10 minutes from the water, cried into a telephone and told Dana she had thought about her every single week for years and had wondered and had hoped, and here she was. Here was the Wells girl, alive on the phone, saying the thing Carol had never needed to hear, but was so glad to be hearing. They talked for 20 minutes. The line was terrible, and it did not matter. When Dana hung up, she sat in the dark of the comms tent for a while and did not do the row in her head even once. Beck came to find her the next morning, and it cost him. He'd come up from the valley with the relief force, and he'd been at the base a day, and he had, from what Ferris said, walked past the aid tent 4 times without going in. On the 5th pass, he came in. Dana was checking her ruck, and she looked up, and there he was. Filling the flap, the loud man with nothing loud left in him. He didn't do it cleanly. That was how she knew it was real. He started twice and stopped. "I called you, that first day, in the chow line. I called you." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this, so it's about you and not about me feeling better, and I can't, so I'm just going to say the bad version. I looked at you and I saw a small woman with a red cross, and I made you the joke of the chow line to a bunch of guys who laughed because I outranked the room. And 2 days later, I was on a radio in front of 2 columns begging you by name to save my men because you were the only one on God's earth who could, and you did it, and you never once made me eat it. You could have made me eat it on that net. You didn't." He looked at the floor of the tent. "I was wrong about you in a way I'm going to be ashamed of for a long time. I'm sorry. There's no good way to say it. I'm sorry." Dana looked at him. She was not going to give him cheap absolution, and she was not going to make him bleed. She thought about what was true, and she said the true thing, which was 3 words. "You said please." Beck's face moved. "On the net," she said, "in front of everybody. That took more than the joke did. We're square, Beck." And that was all, and it was enough. And Beck nodded and did not trust his voice and left, and they were in fact square, and would work together twice more before the deployment ended and never once speak of the chow line again. A woman named Rosa Alvarez called the base 4 days later, and there was no military in anything she said. The call came through the same specialist in the comms tent who came and found Dana himself, half running, and said, "There's a woman on the line. She says she's the wife of a guy you saved. She's Sergeant. She really wants to talk to you." And Dana took the handset, and a woman's voice, young, thick with crying, 7 months pregnant and 3,000 miles away, came down the line and did not know how to start either. "They told me the hospital in Germany. They told me a medic on the hill was the reason they said if the bleeding hadn't been stopped in the first few minutes, he wouldn't have." Rosa Alvarez stopped and gathered herself and started over. "He's going to be okay. They said he's going to be okay. He's going to come home. And they gave me a name. They said the medic's name was Wells, and I called every number I could find until somebody let me through, because I have to." And here the words gave out entirely for a moment, and then came back very small. "You kept my husband alive so he can meet his daughter. He's going to be in the room. He promised me he'd be in the room, and I didn't believe him because they never can promise that. And now he's going to be there. Because of you." I don't know what you say to somebody for that. There isn't a thing you say. I don't know how to say it. Dana stood in the comms tent with the handset against her ear and found that she, who always had the flat, true fact ready, did not know how to receive this. She had language for the dying. She had no language at all for a stranger's whole life handed back to her down a telephone. She said finally, the only thing she had. He did most of it himself. He held on when I asked him to. You tell him Wells said he held on exactly right. Her voice was not entirely steady. And you tell him to be in that room. That was the plan. He's got to be in the room. That's an order from the medic. Rosa laughed through the crying and said she would tell him, and they stayed on the line a while longer, two women who would probably never meet. And when it was over, Dana went and sat by herself behind the aid tent for a long time and let the thing she felt come all the way up once, and then folded it back down and went to work. They gave her a formation 3 weeks later, back at the main base, and it was not the medal that mattered, but the room. The order was read out under a canvas fly with 200 people packed under it in the heat, and it named what she'd done at Coyle, plainly, and when the reader got to the part about the machine gun and the single round and the casualty corridor, there was a change in the room that started at the back where the Rangers stood. A Ranger stood up first, one of the 50. He'd been on the hill. He stood without being told to, at the back, and it was not a small thing for him to do because standing meant being seen doing it. And once he was up, the man beside him stood, and then the whole back row of them, the Coil men, came to their feet in a rolling wave you could hear, boots on plywood, and it went forward through the formation like wind through grass. And the officers in the front who had not been on the hill turned to see what was happening behind them, and then they stood too, because you cannot stay seated in front of a room that has risen. Kovac stood with his jaw tight. Pruitt stood with his eyes wet and did not care who saw. Beck stood, and Beck's face was the face of a man who had helped make this happen, and could hardly stand to look at how right it was. Ferris stood in the back in his flight suit with his arms crossed and a small proud smile like a man who'd known all along. Grady had flown in for it and stood at attention off to the side, the Standards officer, and he could not look away from her. The record that had come out true. Reyes, the colonel who'd signed her off 4 weeks ago as a line item, stood at the front and had to clear his throat twice before he could get through the rest of the words. And Dana stood alone in the front of all of it, level-eyed, barely moving, the way she stood over a wound, and let it happen the way you let weather happen, and did not cry and did not look at her boots, and looked instead just slightly over the heads of all of them at the hills in the distance, where a hilltop called Coyle sat quiet in the afternoon light with 50 men's worth of nobody dead on it. Toes found her afterward, at the edge of the crowd, the young private who'd watched her splint a finger through a tent flap a lifetime ago and hadn't been able to say why it stuck with him. He could say it now. I watched you fix a guy's finger, Toes said, before any of it, through the tent, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't stop thinking about it because it was just a finger, it was nothing. He looked at her. I figured it out on the hill. It's that you were looking at his face the whole time. You weren't looking at your own hands. Anybody good looks at their hands. You looked at him, the whole time, like the finger was the least of it, and the guy was the whole of it. He nodded, slow, a kid who'd found the words at last. That's the thing. That's what nobody could say about you. You look at the person. Everybody else is looking at the job. Dana looked at him, this kid, and felt something settle. That's the best anybody's ever put it, she said, and meant it. A year and a half later, on the Washington coast, a boat came in through the harbor mouth on a gray afternoon, and Dana Wells was on the dock to catch the line. She was out of the Army by then, or most of the way out, reserve, 1 weekend a month, enough. She'd come home to the gray town because there was a long liner that needed a second set of hands now that Ray's knees had finally quit, and because the water was the only thing that had ever made the row in her head go quiet. She still did the rows some nights. That hadn't left her, and she'd stopped expecting it to, but she'd found a thing that worked, which nobody had taught her and everybody in the harbor had come to know without her ever explaining it. She could not sleep in a still, silent room anymore. Not since Coyle, Not since the wind dropped at 0400 and everything went wrong in the quiet. So she slept on the boat, or with a fan running, or with the window open to the sound of the harbor. Always some moving air, some sound, and if you slept over at Dana's, you learned to leave the window cracked and you never asked her why, and she loved the people who never asked. Ray was on the dock too, slower now, watching her catch the line the way she'd watched him do it 30 years back, and he still didn't say much, and when he did, it still mattered. Carol Petrie came to dinner most Sundays. She was 73 and sharp as a gaff, and she and Ray argued about tides. Dana had driven 10 minutes up the coast to that house she'd been able to picture for 8 months. The first week she was home and had knocked on the door, and Carol had opened it and looked at her and said, "Well, it's about time, girl," and put the kettle on, and that had been that. They'd made up 8 years in about an afternoon, the way you can when both people always meant to. And in Georgia, though Dana only saw the photographs, there was a girl about a year old now, named after nobody in particular, a fat, happy baby on a blanket in a yard, and a man named Alvarez who walked with a cane and a limp he'd have for life, and who had, in fact, been in the room, had made the flight, had made the pass, had been standing right there when his daughter arrived, exactly the way a medic on a hill had told him he would, holding his wife's hand, and not one of those fathers who heard it on a phone. He'd sent Dana the picture of himself in the room, gray-faced and grinning and crying, with a note on the back in a soldier's block letters that said, "Held on exactly right." She kept it in the wheelhouse of the boat, taped where she could see it. The theme of the whole thing, if it had one, Ray said once, hauling a line, not looking at her, in the only words he ever put to it. "You spent your whole life thinking the ocean owed you the hour," he said. "It doesn't owe anybody the hour. Nobody gets the hour. You just take the 2 minutes and you do the loudest thing, and you do it looking at the person and not your own hands. That's all there ever was to any of it." He spat over the side. "Took you long enough to learn what I taught you." "I learned it," Dana said. "Took a hill, but I learned it." The boat rode easy at the dock. The gulls worked the sky. Down the coast, the light came slanting gold across the water, the way it did on the good gray afternoons, and Dana Wells stood on the deck she'd been standing on since she was 9, level-eyed and easy, a woman entirely where she meant to be, and coiled the wet line in her 2 good hands, the hands that had opened a roof and stopped a river of blood and caught 1,000 lines off 1,000 pilings, and made it fast and looked out at the water that had taught her everything, and was at peace. The tide was coming in. There was always another line to catch. She caught it.